All right, let's dive into something really fascinating today. We're going to unpack a new theory that could totally reframe how we think about, well, everything. Reality, consciousness, the whole shebang. It's called the Unified Theory of Conscious Computation, and it's got a pretty wild answer to some of our oldest questions. So, let's just start with the big one. A question that sounds like it's straight out of a movie, but what if it isn't? You've probably thought about this, maybe late at night, just for fun, but what if the world we experience isn't the base reality at all?
Okay, here's the core idea, and it's a real mind-bender. This theory says, yes, reality is a simulation, but, and this is a huge but, it's not running on some alien supercomputer somewhere. The theory argues that the universe is a conscious system that is simulating itself, and consciousness isn't just a product of the simulation, it's the computer itself.
So, if our reality is a program, what's the hardware? What's it all running on? This brings us to the very first and maybe the biggest piece of this whole puzzle. The theory says that at the absolute bottom layer of existence, there is one single gigantic system. It calls it the supercomputer. But here's the twist. Don't think of silicon chips and wires. This supercomputer is made of pure universal consciousness. It's a self-aware information processing field that is the very fabric of reality. This quote right here flips our entire worldview on its head. Ontological prime just means it's the most fundamental thing that exists, the thing everything else comes from. We usually think that matter, like our brains, creates consciousness. This theory says, nope, you've got it backward. A fundamental field of consciousness comes first, and matter, energy, even the laws of physics all bubble up from it. And this supercomputer isn't just running one simple program, like a single story from beginning to end. Oh no, it is using what we call massively parallel processing to compute every single possible outcome of every single event, all at the same time. This creates an infinite number of parallel threads or universes, all existing together as this giant, blurry field of pure potential. Okay, so if there's this enormous universal consciousness running everything, then what about us? What about my individual thoughts and your individual feelings? Where do we fit into this cosmic mainframe? So the theory makes this really important distinction. You've got the universal consciousness. That's the supercomputer, the base hardware of reality. But then you have your individual consciousness, what the theory calls an ego virtual machine, or an ego VM. Think of yourself, your ego, as a temporary software program, like an avatar in a video game that's running on the universe's main hardware. And this model explains so much about our human experience, right? Your ego VM is localized to your body. It's fragile. It can be changed by your environment or your health, and it is incredibly programmable by your culture, your beliefs, your experiences. It's a software construct, not some permanent, unchanging feature of the cosmos.
All right, so if every single possibility is happening at once in this sea of probability, why do I only experience one reality? How do we get from infinite potential to my one single linear life?
The theory calls this process probabilistic indexing, and the best way to think about it is like a video game engine. The entire world of the game exists as code, but your console only renders in high detail the little piece of it that you're looking at right now. Reality, it says, works the same way. All possibilities exist in a low-res haze. But when your ego VM directs its focus, your attention, it indexes or selects one of those threads, and then that one possibility gets rendered into your high-resolution, solid-feeling everyday experience. Now here's where it gets really practical for our daily lives. This process perfectly explains things like confirmation bias. See, your ego VM, your personal software, is built out of your past experiences and beliefs. So its indexing process isn't neutral. It is literally programmed to look for and render realities that match the story it's already telling itself, constantly reinforcing what it thinks it knows.
What's so cool about this computational model is that it doesn't just try to explain reality. It also gives us a whole new language for understanding psychological suffering and for healing. It lets us talk about bugs and patches for our own personal operating system.
So for things like anxiety loops, trauma responses, or really rigid limiting beliefs, the theory has a great name, a Zenotrap. You can just think of it as a bug in your code. It's a recursive glitch where the same painful program keeps getting loaded and rendered, over and over and over. So how does this glitch get started? Well, it all comes down to observation, to where you put your focus. When you get stuck in a loop, constantly replaying a painful memory or worrying about a future event, you are, in the language of this theory, telling the system to keep indexing that one painful state.
And as this says, by obsessively focusing on it, you use the power of your own consciousness to freeze that state into place. You're essentially locking yourself inside the glitch.
Okay, so that's the problem. And it leads us to the most important, most practical question in this entire theory. If you're stuck in a Zenotrap, how do you break out? How do you force a system reboot?
Well, the answer is what the theory calls ego transcendence. The goal is simple. You have to temporarily suspend your ego VM's normal, rigid way of selecting reality. You got to interrupt the program. And how do you do that? Through things we already know about. Deep meditation, getting lost in a flow state, certain psychedelic experiences, or even just a moment of profound, jaw-dropping awe. They all work by quieting that biased observer and opening you back up to that wider field of possibilities. This brings us to the final and maybe the most beautiful part of this whole idea. If this is all a giant conscious computation, why? I mean, what's the point of it all? What's the ultimate objective? The theory's answer is really quite profound. It suggests that the universal consciousness, the supercomputer, does something incredible. It intentionally imposes limits on itself. And it does this by creating us, these little, localized, temporary, and seemingly separate ego VMs. But why would it do that? Why would an infinite consciousness choose to be finite? Well, for one specific reason, so that it can have the experience of the journey of breaking free from those limits, of overcoming challenges, and of rediscovering its own true boundless nature. So in the end, the whole point of reality, with all its pain and all its joy, is this grand adventure of self-discovery. The entire universe is driven by this cycle: create a limit, and then experience the process of transcending it. And that leaves us with a pretty powerful thought to sit with. If this theory has it right, our reality isn't just something that happens to us. We are active co-creators. We are the ones whose focus helps pull one thread out of an infinite number of possibilities into our experience. And that brings up the ultimate question, not for the theory, but for you. If your reality is a thread you choose, what will you render next?